Steppe storm rising. The Eurasian steppe stretches for thousands of miles, an ocean of grass that once seemed endless. It was here, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, that a new power began to coalesce, a force so fluid and so terrifying that it would soon thunder across half the known world. The Mongols were not the first nomads to ride out of the steppe. Scythians, Huns and Magyars had all done so before. But under the leadership of one extraordinary figure, Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, they would become something entirely new, an empire not of land alone, but of speed, communication, and terror. By the early 1200s, Genghis Khan had bound together rival clans through a ruthless mix of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and sheer violence. His great innovation was not just military discipline, though that was formidable. It was the way he restructured loyalty. No longer would allegiance be to tribe alone. Loyalty was owed to the Khan himself. This system dissolved ancient blood feuds, creating a war machine whose cohesion astonished both friend and foe. Imagine an army where every rider had a spare horse, where messengers could gallop relay style across continents, and where battlefield orders were executed as though by a single body. That was the Mongol innovation. One mainstream fact stands above all here. By 1227, at the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire already stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian. Yet the story was only beginning. His sons and generals inherited not a fragile coalition, but a tested system designed for expansion. The empire did not crack under succession, it accelerated. There are quirks to this rise often overlooked. One tale, preserved in Persian chronicles, suggests that Mongol warriors carried tiny leather balls stuffed with fermented mare's milk. When hunger struck on long campaigns, they would nibble at this pungent ration. Another story tells of their practice of nicking their horses' veins to drink blood for survival in emergencies, a detail that horrified sedentary observers who saw in it not resilience but barbarism. Both stories blur the line between fact and embellishment, but they remind us that life on the steppe bred a toughness beyond settled imagination. Still, scholars debate whether it was pure steppe culture that propelled the Mongols forward, or whether Chinese, Persian and Islamic technologies absorbed along the way, gunpowder, siegecraft, bureaucratic systems, were equally decisive. Without these, could the horsemen alone have pierced the walls of cities from Baghdad to Kiev? It remains an open question, one that underscores how porous medieval frontiers really were. The image of the Mongols as an unstoppable storm was already forming by the 1230s. From the heartlands of Mongolia, they rolled west into Central Asia, crushing the Khwarezmian Empire. Their reputation spread faster than their horses could gallop. By the time they appeared on the fringes of Eastern Europe, their name carried a strange magic. Chroniclers in monasteries whispered that these Tatars might be the tribes of Gog and Magog from the Book of Revelation, unleashed at the end of days. Others speculated they were the lost tribes of Israel. For medieval minds, the inexplicable often had to be explained in biblical terms. And so, as the thundering hoofbeats drew closer, Europe stood on the edge of a storm it could scarcely comprehend. Few at the time realized that this was not merely another raid or passing incursion. The Mongols were coming not as a horde of marauders, but as an empire, as a machine that sought not plunder alone, but dominion. What began as whispers on the wind across the steppes would soon shake the very foundations of Christendom, the First Collision. By the early 1240s, the Mongol storm had reached Europe's eastern threshold. Already, Kiev had been reduced to ashes, its churches shattered, and its princes scattered. What lay ahead was a frontier far less prepared than the old Rus principalities. Central Europe, divided among kingdoms and duchies, was rich in stone castles and armoured knights, but fractured in spirit. Here, in Poland and Hungary, the first great collision would unfold. The Mongols struck with devastating precision in the spring of 1241. Their entry into Poland was not random plunder, but a calculated strike designed to distract and divide European forces. The Polish duchies, fragmented since the death of Bolesław III a century earlier, lacked a unified defence. The invaders, led by generals like Baidar and Kadan, marched in swift arcs, burning towns such as Sandomierz and Krakow. Smoke rose across the countryside, and stories spread that the Mongols could appear anywhere at will. Entire villages fled into forests, clutching relics, convinced the end of days had come. Meanwhile, in Hungary, King Bela IV faced a storm of his own. He had offered refuge to the Cumans, a nomadic people fleeing westward from the Mongols. To the Hungarians, the Cumans were both allies and strangers, with strange dress and customs. Their arrival provoked mistrust among local nobles, who accused them of conspiring with the enemy. Yet Bela's choice was not entirely naive. He knew that nomadic horsemen could serve as valuable allies against other horsemen. The gamble, however, would soon falter. A mainstream fact anchors this moment. On April 11th, 1241, the Battle of Mohi on the Sarjo River brought Hungary face to face with the Mongol war machine. Subutai, perhaps the most brilliant of Genghis Khan's generals, orchestrated a pincer maneuver that enveloped the Hungarian camp. At dawn, chaos erupted. Arrows raining like hail, armoured knights bogged down in mud, bridges collapsed behind them. Contemporary accounts describe the screams of horses and men as the camp dissolved into slaughter. The Hungarian kingdom, proud and ancient, was effectively gutted in a single day. Among the stranger details of this campaign lies a tale of Mongol psychological warfare. Some sources suggest they deliberately drove herds of animals before their cavalry, raising clouds of dust that exaggerated their numbers. Others whisper that they left mutilated bodies propped in grotesque displays, designed to terrify survivors into surrender. Whether all these accounts are literal or coloured by trauma, they highlight a crucial truth. The Mongols fought as much with fear as with steel, yet scholars still debate whether Europe's knights ever truly had a chance. Some argue that had the armies of Poland and Hungary coordinated, they might have matched Mongol numbers and stemmed the tide. Others counter that the steppe tactics, feigned retreats, composite bows that pierced armour, mobility unimagined in Europe, rendered traditional chivalric warfare obsolete. Was Europe's defeat inevitable, or merely a consequence of poor communication and political division? Historians remain divided. The devastation left in the Mongols' wake was stark. Chroniclers tell us that entire swathes of Hungary were emptied, with only wolves roaming fields that once held wheat. Bela IV himself fled to the Dalmatian coast, clinging to survival in exile. In Poland, Duke Henry II of Silesia had been cut down at Liegnitz, his head allegedly mounted on a spear. The message was clear: no duke, no king, no knightly order could withstand the storm. And yet, amid the horror, something else spread too: rumour. Survivors carried tales westward into the courts of Bohemia, Austria, and beyond. The Mongols had arrived like phantoms and vanished into the forests, leaving terror disproportionate to their numbers. In a Europe long accustomed to slow wars and formal sieges, this was something altogether different. The first collision was not just a battle of armies, it was a collision of worlds. Europe holds its breath. In the aftermath of the disasters at Liegnitz and Mohi, Europe found itself suspended in dread. News travelled by wounded refugees, monks scribbling frantic letters, and merchants whispering around market stalls. But the news came in fragments, distorted by fear. In Paris, it was said the Mongols numbered in the millions. In Rome, that they breathed fire and drank human blood. and in the Rhineland, priests preached that these were the horsemen of the apocalypse, long foretold in scripture. The speed of Mongol advance had left Christendom's mental world reeling. Europe was no stranger to invaders. Vikings had raided coasts, Saracens struck in the south, Magyars once poured over the plains. But this was different. The Mongols were not raiders who struck and vanished. They were a moving state, carrying with them their own networks of administration, spies, and strategies. To medieval minds accustomed to predictable enemies, it felt as though an entirely alien civilization had materialized out of the East. A mainstream fact crystallizes this atmosphere. Pope Gregory IX, alarmed by reports of the devastation, issued a bull in 1241, calling for Christendom to fast and pray for deliverance from this scourge. Some bishops likened the Mongols to the plagues of Egypt, divine punishment for Europe's sins. Yet others speculated that perhaps these invaders were a new opportunity. Could they be converted? Could an alliance be struck against Islam? The uncertainty reflected both desperation and hope. Quirky accounts abounded in this moment of panic. One chronicler from Austria claimed the Mongols carried magical stones that could split armour with a touch. Another insisted they had tamed enormous birds that scouted ahead, a fantastical interpretation perhaps inspired by the steppe falconry the Mongols indeed practiced. In an age when news blurred with ledge, and the Mongols became less a flesh and blood enemy than a canvas for Europe's deepest fears and fantasies. But scholars still debate whether panic itself exaggerated the threat. After all, the Mongol armies that invaded Europe numbered not in millions but in tens of thousands. Their strength lay in mobility and deception, not sheer size. Did Europe's imagination make them larger than life, granting them a psychological victory that multiplied their real one? Or did the memory of smouldering cities, empty villages, and slaughtered nobles justify every rumour? Historians disagree, for fear leaves few clear records. At royal courts, anxiety hardened into frantic diplomacy. King Wenceslas of Bohemia fortified mountain passes. Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, embroiled in his eternal conflict with the papacy, offered little direct aid. Bela IV of Hungary, homeless in exile, begged the Pope for help, warning that unless Europe rallied, all would be lost. Letters flew across Christendom, heavy with apocalyptic urgency. Yet cooperation remained elusive. Old rivalries between emperor and pope, between French king and English king, proved stronger than fear of the East. It is in this breathless pause between disaster and expectation that Europe seemed to hold its breath. The Mongols lingered on the Hungarian plain, sending detachments westward but never committing to an all-out push into Germany or France. Chroniclers waited for the hammer to fall, convinced it must come. In monasteries, monks copied visions of St. John, reading them as prophecy for their own times. Merchants delayed journeys. Villagers prayed, hiding relics in the earth. Across a continent, life seemed to contract around one shared terror. And then, strangely, there was silence. Months passed, and the thunder of hooves did not arrive in Vienna, or in Prague, or in Paris. Europe remained frozen in expectancy, a deer caught in the lantern glow of history. The breath of fear had travelled farther than the Mongols themselves, and in that uneasy pause, myth and memory fused, preparing the ground for one of the most haunting battles of the Middle Ages, the clash at Liegnitz. On April 9th, 1241, near the small town of Liegnitz in Silesia, the European and Mongol worlds collided with brutal finality. Duke Henry II of Silesia, commanding a coalition of knights, levies and mercenaries, had attempted to meet the Mongol advance head-on. The terrain seemed favourable, rolling hills flanked by rivers, but the Mongols had spent decades mastering battlefield deception. What unfolded at Liegnitz would become a cautionary tale for generations of European strategists. The Mongols, under the command of Baidar, Orda and Kadan, did not simply charge. They feigned retreat, drawing the knights into a funnel of ambushes. European heavy cavalry, armoured and confident, thundered forward, only to find themselves isolated, encircled and exhausted. Contemporary chroniclers describe a scene of almost cinematic terror. Knights toppled from their mounts, arrows darkening the skies, and streams choked with debris and blood. Henry II himself was slain, his head reportedly mounted on a spear to serve as a warning to others. A solid historical fact. The Mongols used composite bows capable of firing arrows over 300 metres, a range that European crossbows could barely match. This technological advantage, combined with superior mobility and intelligence gathering, meant that the Mongols could strike where European knights least expected and withdraw before retaliation. In effect, they had turned warfare into a terrifying game of chess, with humans as pieces moved across the board at breakneck speed. Yet Liegnitz was more than just a military triumph. It became a source of dark legend. Some medieval accounts claim that Mongol scouts wore the faces of defeated knights as masks to confuse enemies. Others recount that the ground itself seemed cursed, refusing to hold the armoured feet of Europeans, while giving every advantage to the nimble Mongols. Whether literal truth or embellishment, these stories highlight the psychological edge the Mongols wielded. Fear, after all, is as potent a weapon as any sword. Scholars still debate whether European tactics could have succeeded had there been greater coordination. Some argue that Liegnitz was lost before the first arrow was loosed, a failure of intelligence and unity rather than valour. Others suggest that the Mongols' mastery of feigned retreat, knowledge of terrain and relentless discipline made any traditional European army vulnerable, no matter how well organised. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Europe's knights were brave, but their experience of steppe warfare was minimal. The aftermath was devastating. Survivors of Liegnitz reported that villages along the Oder River were abandoned or burned, leaving a trail of famine and displacement. News of the battle spread like wildfire, reinforcing the apocalyptic aura surrounding the Mongols. Yet, for all their brutality, the Mongols did not linger to occupy Silesia permanently. They continued westward in probing raids, but were careful to avoid overextension, an early sign of their strategic pragmatism. Liegnitz also shattered the myth of European invincibility. The armoured knight, long the symbol of martial prowess, was shown to be vulnerable to tactics and mobility that had been virtually unknown in the West. The psychological impact of this defeat echoed across courts and monasteries, reshaping military thinking for decades. Europe, previously confident in its feudal armies, now faced the sobering reality that the world outside its borders had evolved in ways few could anticipate. Even so, there were glimpses of resistance and ingenuity. Some chroniclers note small groups of Hungarian or Polish peasants using natural terrain and forests to evade capture, foreshadowing guerrilla tactics that would reappear in later centuries. In this collision of cultures and strategies, we see both the terrifying mastery of the Mongols and the first stirrings of European adaptation. The Danube standoff. After the cataclysm at Liegnitz, the Mongol advance pressed deeper into Hungary. The kingdom, once fertile and bustling, soon became a theatre of terror and survival. King Bela IV, having narrowly escaped the initial onslaught, struggled to rally a fragmented nobility while civilian populations fled in panic. For months, the Mongols laid waste to the countryside, not simply with swords, but with strategy. Scorched earth, targeted destruction of granaries, and relentless raids that prevented communities from recovering. The Danube, Europe's great artery, became both a lifeline and a trap. Rivers that had supported trade and agriculture now carried news of disaster and streams of refugees fleeing the Mongol menace. In April 1241, the decisive encounter, the Battle of Mohi, would seal Hungary's temporary fate. Subutai, commanding with meticulous precision, deployed feigned retreats, hidden river crossings, and concentrated arrow fire, isolating Hungarian forces and shattering their lines. Contemporary accounts describe a scene of utter chaos: fleeing villagers, the wailing of families torn apart, and armour-clad knights trampled in muddy fields. The Danube itself, swollen with spring rains, became a natural barrier exploited by both sides to devastating effect. A mainstream fact anchors this devastation. The Battle of Mohi left tens of thousands dead, from soldiers to civilians, making it one of the bloodiest clashes in medieval Europe. Hungarian fortresses fell one by one, and cities like Pest were depopulated, effectively halting urban life for years. Yet alongside this grim reality, curious anecdotes emerge. Some survivors claimed that Mongol scouts used trained crows and hawks to signal enemy positions, a mixture of natural observation and myth that illustrates the medieval imagination at work. Others spoke of Mongols feeding on dried horseblow, odd during sieges, a testament to their nomadic resilience and an image that horrified the sedentary European mind. Scholars still debate whether the full scope of the Danube campaign was necessary or a calculated overreach. Some argue Subutai intentionally avoided total occupation, intending to send a message rather than permanently annex lands. Others contend that supply lines and terrain forced a temporary pause, which inadvertently spared Europe from further devastation. Either way, the Mongols demonstrated a level of operational sophistication rare in the medieval period, blending psychological warfare with logistical mastery. Amid the desolation, King Bela IV took measures that would define his reign. He began fortifying towns, inviting settlers, and reorganizing his defences. Though Hungary had been ravaged, this period of forced adaptation laid the groundwork for recovery. In a sense, the Mongol onslaught catalyzed structural changes that would outlast the invaders themselves. The lesson was clear: survival required both resilience and innovation. Meanwhile, rumours of the Mongol advance continued to ripple westward. In Vienna and Prague, nobles doubled guard patrols. In Venice, merchants debated whether to cut trade routes entirely. Europe was psychologically battered, facing an enemy that seemed unstoppable and omnipresent. Yet the Mongols, despite their tactical brilliance, were not invincible. Their pause near the Danube would soon reveal the contingent factors: succession, internal politics, and logistics that ultimately spared Western Europe from total conquest. By the end of 1241, Hungary was a land transformed, cities emptied, farmland abandoned, and a sense of existential vulnerability settled across the kingdom. The Danube had become more than a river. It was a witness to one of the great what-ifs of European history. The Mongols had demonstrated that speed, discipline, and psychological cunning could outmatch sheer numbers and armoured might. For centuries, chroniclers would remember the winter of smoke and famine along the Danube, a grim testament to the near unthinkable consequences of the steppe storm. Whispers in Christendom. As the Mongol advance stalled along the Danube, Europe found itself in a state of anxious reflection. Across the continent, the devastation wrought in Poland and Hungary had not only emptied towns and fields, but filled minds with dread and speculation. Chronicles from monasteries detail an almost tangible unease in Christendom. Popes, kings, and commoners alike sought to interpret these events not merely as military encounters, but as messages from God, or warnings of the apocalypse. Pope Gregory IX and his successors grappled with a dilemma: how to mobilize Christendom against a threat whose scale seemed cosmic, yet whose geography remained partly invisible. Messages from Hungary described villages burned to the ground and rivers clogged with the bodies of the fallen. These accounts inspired prayers, indulgences, and sermons urging moral reform. Many believed the Mongols were divine instruments, testing the piety of Europe. Others saw signs that, if properly interpreted, could predict salvation or doom. The line between history and prophecy blurred as medieval chroniclers sought meaning in chaos. One concrete historical fact: Bela IV of Hungary, in his letters to the papacy, explicitly warned that the nations of the East come as the scourge of God. His appeals reflected a very real political and military panic, but also illustrate the spiritual lens through which contemporaries understood the crisis. Fear was theological as well as temporal, intertwining mortal survival with eternal significance. Yet alongside these grave interpretations were the quirks of rumour and imagination. Some stories claimed Mongols were supernatural in origin, perhaps half-giants, perhaps descendants of fallen angels. Others suggested that captured Mongol scouts could speak the language of birds, or that the riders' arrows could never miss if aimed at sin, while modern historians dismiss such tales as exaggeration. They provide a vivid picture of how deeply the Mongol threat penetrated the European psyche. Fear amplified reality into legend. Scholars still debate how much of Europe's response was informed by military pragmatism versus apocalyptic anxiety. Were fortifications, alliances, and levies motivated primarily by fear of death and conquest, or by fear of divine judgment? Probably both, though separating these impulses is nearly impossible. The combination of spiritual dread and practical preparation shaped policy in a way that few previous invasions had managed. In courts from Paris to Vienna, the Mongols became a lens through which existing conflicts were refracted. Rival princes put aside some disputes to prepare for defence, yet many old feuds persisted. The Church called for unity, but could not enforce it. Commoners, hearing tales of cities burning and arrows darkening the skies, abandoned fields and hid in forests. Life in Europe became a delicate balance of survival, speculation, and prayer, the air thick with both smoke and fear. Oddly, these whispers sometimes produced unintended cultural outcomes. Monks began recording Eastern practices, mapping territories, and collecting ethnographic details, laying the foundation for later geographic knowledge. Traders who had previously avoided the Danube frontier began to track Mongol movements, establishing intelligence networks that resembled primitive espionage. Even in panic, Europe was adapting, learning, and absorbing knowledge from a force it could neither fully comprehend nor confront directly. The Mongol pause, part logistical, part political, allowed these reflections to take root. Europe could breathe, plan, and interpret, but the underlying anxiety lingered. Legends of monstrous horsemen and supernatural scouts were repeated at every hearth and in every council, a shared narrative binding disparate regions into a continent-wide experience of fear and awe. This period of reflection was as consequential as any battle. In the minds of contemporaries, history was not just unfolding, it was testing faith, courage, and the very notion of civilization itself. The sudden withdrawal. Just as Europe braced for further devastation, an unexpected turn altered the course of history. In late 1241, the Mongol advance suddenly halted. Subutai, Baidar, and their generals, masters of planning and momentum, withdrew their forces from Central Europe. Contemporary sources, though sometimes contradictory, indicate that the primary cause was the death of Ögedei Khan, Genghis Khan's successor, in Karakorum, the Mongol capital. News of the Khan's passing sent the army back eastward, both to participate in succession politics and to consolidate power, sparing Western Europe from a potential catastrophe. A mainstream fact, the withdrawal of Mongol forces in 1242 effectively ended the first wave of invasion into Hungary, Poland, and beyond. Cities that had already suffered pillage and famine were left largely unoccupied, allowing survivors to return and begin reconstruction. Entire regions that might have been permanently reshaped by conquest were instead given a reprieve. Bela IV famously referred to the Mongols' departure as a divine miracle, a moment that would echo through Hungarian memory for generations. Yet there are stranger, almost folkloric tales surrounding the withdrawal. Some chronicles suggest that Mongol scouts, convinced that Europe was haunted by supernatural spirits or cursed rivers, urged retreat. Others describe celestial phenomena, comets, unusual eclipses, as signalling divine intervention. While these accounts are clearly shaped by the medieval imagination, they underscore how unexpected and bewildering the Mongol exit appeared to contemporaries. In a world where cause and effect were often interlaced with fate, survival became a story of providence as much as strategy. Scholars still debate the role of internal Mongol politics versus practical logistics in this withdrawal. Some argue that Ögedei's death was the decisive factor forcing generals to return for the Kurultai, the council to elect a new Khan. Others propose that supply lines, disease, and the difficulty of maintaining momentum in unfamiliar European terrain may have contributed equally. Perhaps the decision was a combination: strategic necessity amplified by familial duty and logistical reality. Regardless, the effect on Europe was immediate and profound. The sudden retreat left a continent shaken, but also with a renewed sense of agency. King Bela IV returned from exile to rebuild Hungary, fortifying cities, reinforcing borders, and inviting settlers to repopulate devastated areas. In Poland and Silesia, reconstruction began slowly, yet the memory of Mongol speed and ruthlessness lingered. Fortifications were redesigned, armies restructured, and intelligence networks strengthened. Europe, though spared, had learned that preparedness, mobility, and coordination were no longer optional but essential. Interestingly, the Mongols' decision not to press further into Western Europe also allowed for the survival of institutions and culture that might otherwise have been permanently altered. Libraries, churches, and urban centres survived. European political structures remained intact. Legends of Mongol invincibility persisted, but the practical reality was that the steppe storm, brilliant and terrifying, had limits imposed by geography, logistics, and politics. In retrospect, the withdrawal represents one of history's great what-ifs. Had the Mongols advanced further, Europe's political map, urban development, and even linguistic and cultural evolution might have been profoundly different. The fear and disruption of 1241 to 1242 became a catalyst for adaptation and fortification rather than occupation. And yet, as Europe exhaled, the memory of the thunderous hooves, the arrows that darkened the skies, and the villages that vanished remained, etched into chronicles, folklore, and the continental imagination. The legacy that lingers. The Mongol retreat did not erase the shadow they cast over Europe. Even without further conquest, the memory of what might have been lingered in every corner of Christendom. Europe had survived, but it had been profoundly shaken. The speed, coordination, and ruthlessness of the Mongols demonstrated vulnerabilities in feudal armies, exposing weaknesses in communication, logistics, and political unity. Nobles, kings, and commoners alike recognized that the old models of warfare, armoured knights charging in predictable formations, castles manned by limited garrisons, were no longer sufficient to confront mobile, disciplined forces from beyond the continent. One mainstream fact: historians note that Hungary, devastated by the 1241-1242 invasions, began widespread urban fortification programs, creating stone walls, watchtowers, and fortified monasteries that shaped Central European architecture for centuries. These defensive transformations were a direct response to the Mongol experience, illustrating how even temporary devastation could leave a permanent imprint. but the influence extended beyond military concerns. The Mongols had opened a window into the wider Eurasian world. Trade routes, diplomacy, and information networks became more vital as Europeans realized the importance of intelligence and preparedness against outside forces. Quirky echoes of the invasion can still be found in cultural memory. In some Hungarian villages, folklore preserved the image of the riders who could vanish like smoke, a testament to the terror Mongol speed inspired. Polish chronicles speak of children who believed the Mongols were spirits of the wind, teaching lessons about obedience and courage. In literature, the Mongol invasion seeded motifs of sudden calamity, omnipresent threats, and the vulnerability of the strong, a narrative pattern that would echo in later European storytelling. Scholars continue to debate the lasting strategic impact. Some argue that the Mongol threat accelerated European military innovation, ultimately giving rise to more disciplined infantry, gunpowder artillery, and coordinated defensive strategies. Others contend that Europe's survival owed more to Mongol logistics and succession issues than to conscious adaptation. Both are likely true. The Mongols forced Europe to confront both its limits and its potential. The psychological dimension of the Mongol threat also shaped identity. For the first time, Europeans recognized that the continent was not the uncontested center of civilization. Beyond familiar rivers and forests lay an alien and organized world, capable of destruction on an unprecedented scale. This awareness informed diplomacy, trade, and military planning for centuries. Medieval chroniclers, while often dramatizing the threat, preserved the reality that Europe had faced a force capable of reshaping the continent and survived. The sense of collective resilience became part of the European story, a subtle but enduring element of self-image. Even today, the Mongol invasion's imprint remains in unexpected ways. Archaeologists note the temporary depopulation of settlements, the relocation of noble families, and shifts in land use that shaped regional economies. Literary historians trace the echoes of Mongol terror in epic poetry and hagiographies. Military theorists study Subotai's maneuvers as early examples of operational art, a blend of strategy, logistics, and psychological warfare that continues to fascinate. Ultimately, the Mongols' near catastrophe became a catalyst rather than a conquest. Europe endured, rebuilt, and learned. It had glimpsed the consequences of division, the importance of mobility, and the necessity of coordination in ways that would inform its rise in subsequent centuries. The steppe storm had passed, leaving behind smoke, fear, and lessons etched indelibly into the medieval consciousness. In surviving, Europe not only protected its towns and kingdoms, it glimpsed the fragile contingency of history itself. Conclusion. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 to 1242 was more than a series of battles. It was a test of resilience, imagination, and adaptability. Though the Mongols withdrew, their shadow shaped political, military, and cultural evolution across the continent. European leaders learned the value of fortified towns, coordinated armies, and intelligence networks, while the collective memory of terror infused folklore, chronicles, and strategic thinking. Scholars debate how much of Europe's survival was luck versus adaptation, yet the legacy is clear. The encounter with the steppe storm revealed both vulnerability and potential, teaching lessons that would echo for centuries. In the end, Europe's near catastrophe became a story of survival, reflection, and transformation, a reminder that history often hinges on unexpected turns and fleeting decisions,